As we continue our conversation about the continent of Africa here at Ngong Hills in the Rift Valley in the Republic of Kenya, we are witnessing a relay race between rain and sunshine. That is the beauty of the continent of Africa, and it's so fitting that we are doing this when our focus is on Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism has a long history, and its history spanned to the 1900s. In those early days, when in the diaspora, Africans who had been taken away to the United States of America, to Europe and the Caribbean, were struggling to liberate themselves from the chains of slavery and decolonization. It is in those early days that the Pan-African spirit started to emerge in its embryonic days. We, of course, credit a number of individuals, but one considered as the father of Pan-Africanism in those early days was W.B. Du Bois. But the very first meeting was convened by Henry Sylvester Williams of Trinidad. Thereafter, there were many attempts at bringing Africans together under that spirit of Pan-Africanism. It is in that sense that we must see the efforts of individuals such as Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Although they were not organic Pan-Africanists in the early days, the spirit did capture them. The most iconic of the meetings was the 1945 meeting in Manchester in the United Kingdom, when Africans from the continent were present at that time. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah was present at that meeting, and that was the period when African countries were beginning to fight decolonization, having been colonized by the English, colonized by the French, colonized by the Portuguese, colonized by the Italians, colonized by the Belgians, colonized by the Spaniards. They were seeking to break the chains of decolonization. And when Sudan regained our independence in 1956, it was not as loud as it should have been. It was when Ghana regained our independence on the 6th day of March 1957, and he said that Africa must unite, that the spirit of Pan-Africanism was given greater meaning. But Pan-Africanism must be understood to mean the solidarity of persons of African descent wherever they are, within the mother continent or outside of the mother continent. And in its modern conception, Pan-Africanism must be understood to mean the unity of Africans throughout the world for the benefit of the continent of Africa. When I heard Kwame Nkrumah saying in 1957 that Africa must neither look east nor west, Africa must look forward, he was talking about the revival of Pan-Africanism, the decolonization of Africa. And when he said that the independence of Ghana meant nothing until the whole of Africa was independent, it was a clarion call that Africans must unite, not only to liberate themselves politically, but to liberate themselves economically. Hence the famous statement, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall come." Today, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we are talking about a new spirit, a spirit that not only addresses what may be described as romantic Pan-Africanism or sentimental Pan-Africanism. We are talking about using the African spirit for the purpose of the revival of African peoples wherever they are, in order to achieve success in its totality. And there have been a number of activities around those initiatives. Who will forget in 1966 when Africa met in Dakar, Senegal for the Festival of Arts? Who will forget in 1977 when Africa met in Lagos, Nigeria to celebrate culture, to celebrate art, to celebrate many things? And who will forget that in the spirit of Pan-Africanism today, Africans are seeking reparation for slavery. In the spirit of Pan-Africanism, Africans are seeking reparation for colonization. In the spirit of Pan-Africanism, Africans are seeking the return of their cultural artifacts that now find residence in museums in different parts of Europe and America, Africa are saying we must be given that which was looted. Africans are saying that even what you call the debts that are owed to you through your institutions such as the IMF, such as the World Bank, must be seen as the beginning of reparation. And indeed, one must go down history and remember that when in 1963, on the 25th day of May, the Organization of African Unity was established in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, with the presence of 32 heads of states and government. The idea at that time was that Africa would unite. And indeed, after 1963, there was a Cairo meeting of 1964 and a 1965 meeting in Accra, Ghana, which was meant to be the meeting at which African unity was to be solidified. It never came to pass, and African institution tottered along until a little later, when the spirit was reignited, when Muammar al-Gaddafi, when he became the president of Libya, now started saying, we must revisit the spirit of Nkrumah, we must revisit the spirit of Nyerere, we must revisit the spirit of Modibo Keita, we must revisit the spirit of Samora Moises Machel, we must revisit the spirit of all these great men in order for Africa to occupy her pride of place. Today, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we remember the leaders who are the pioneers. But we also remember that in the recent past, we have had younger people who have contributed to the spirit of Pan-Africanism. You can name many of them. I've already mentioned Nkrumah, I've talked about Nyerere, I've talked about Modibo, I've talked about Patrice Emery Lumumba, I've talked about Kenneth David Kaunda, I've talked about Samora Machel, and much younger, I've talked about people like Thomas Isidore Sankara. Africa has men and women who now believe that the spirit of Pan-Africanism must be reignited in a different way. And through African institutions, we must now begin to talk about a continent that is no longer ashamed. We must no longer talk about a continent that defines ourselves in the terms of the former colonizers as Anglophone or Lusophone or Francophone. We must only be Afrophone, because it is in that state and from that standpoint that Africa can engage the world from a standpoint of respect, from a standpoint of strength, and recent initiatives which are Pan-Africanist in character, such as Africa Agenda 2063, must not be allowed to be mere slogans. Things and initiatives such as Africa Continental Free Trade Area must not be allowed to be just initiatives which will be dead on arrival. They must be infused with the spirit of Pan-Africanism, so that Africans within the mother continent and Africans in the diaspora can begin to pull in one direction. I remember so very fondly these words of Malcolm X, when he said that an African anywhere in the world will never ever be respected until the day that the mother continent is respected. And I have no doubt in my mind that what the colonialists tried to erase is now beginning to emerge. History, through the midwifery of people like Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, now tells us and confirms to us that Africa is the cradle of civilization. History now confirms to us that the spirit of Pan-Africanism must be the tailwind that will push the continent of Africa in the direction that she must go, politically, economically, spiritually, and otherwise. The continent is at a crossroads, and the question is, how do we behave? And I know how. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our institutions. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our minds. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our economies. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our politics. one of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our education. And when we decolonize all those institutions, and when we decolonize our minds, then we can go yonder into the world and tell the world, behold, we are Africans who have no apologies to make, and we can invoke the spirit of the pioneering Pan-Africanists. And there is no shortage of them today who have embraced that spirit. And I have no doubt in my mind that it can be done. Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o has written a book which I commend to anybody who thinks about latter-day Pan-Africanism, decolonization of the mind. Because it is true that when the mind is colonized, then you are going nowhere. When writing in 1950s, Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called Miseducation of the Negro. He was telling the blacks in United States of America that you have been miseducated for too long. And the time now is to re-educate yourself. And I believe that in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we are going to re-educate ourselves. I believe in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we are going to have new initiatives. In the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we are going to give meaning to what Africa stands for, and that is total liberation of her sons and daughters. And when she does that, she is doing that not because she wants to isolate herself from the world, but because she knows that the mother continent is the cradle of all civilization. That is why throughout the ages, in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we have always been welcoming. So today, let us remind ourselves that our Pan-Africanism is not about building walls around the continent of Africa, but creating bridges in a spirit that will ensure justice, in a spirit that will ensure that we are respected, in a spirit that will ensure that we are sojourners in the world in a manner that will define our future and in a manner that will define humanity. That is the Pan-African spirit. The conversation around the mother continent Africa never dies, never wanes. But we must say goodbye to meet another time to converse around the mother continent.
The world is changing, and so is Africa's reality. Political shifts, new partnerships, and economic opportunities. And we're here to uncover why and how it's done. What do the billion-dollar IMF loans have to do with the Kenyan unrest? Are US and French troops actually withdrawing from African states after years of presence? Is Europe's so-called green agenda so green and helpful after all? Why are more and more African countries increasing trade with Russia? And how is Britain lending Africa the treasures London looted? Now, from colonial legacies and security to the future of African democracies, we break down the key challenges ahead and analyze the solutions. While the world is watching Africa, tune in with us and question more with RT International on MAISHA TV, Kenya.
Our conversation about the mother continent continues. And today we want to focus on a subject that is significant to the continent: currencies. One of the legacies of colonization is that all African countries inherited currencies that they did not create. And these currencies have become the medium via which the economies of African countries are judged and the media via which Africans conduct commerce. Today, there are nearly 42 different currencies in the continent of Africa. And this in and of itself creates an environment that is very volatile, because these currencies are not in many ways determined in terms of their value from the countries that run them, so that many African central banks may know the volume of money that is in the market. Many African countries may know the currencies that they want printed, but the most important thing that they ought to know, which is how do we control these currencies, is controlled from elsewhere. We already know, for example, that in most of the former French colonies, the 14 of them in most of the Sahelian region and in Central Africa, most of the currencies are controlled from Paris, and there is a common currency called the CFA franc. The question is, therefore, how can Africa control her economy in an environment where she does not control her currency? And since the year 1972, many African countries have pegged their currencies on the United States dollar. And the United States dollar is a fiat currency. It is a currency that is not backed by any resources. It migrated long ago from the days of Richard Nixon, from the gold standard, and they can print as much as they desire, and most of it finds its way in the continent of Africa as the medium of transaction. There are countries in Africa, for example, Zimbabwe, which for a long time used the American dollar as the currency of trade. And in many African countries, on a daily basis, the central banks determine the strength or otherwise of their currencies depending on the mood of the dollar. As the saying goes, when the dollar sneezes, African currencies go into a coma. And this is something that is undesirable. If you are not in control of your currency, it means that you cannot control your economy. And you will find, for example, in many African countries, even when loans are being borrowed from multilateral institutions such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or even the European Union, the denominated currency is the United States dollars and, of course, recently the euro. The question that Africa must therefore ask is, how can we have an economy or economies which are dictated to from outside? I remember so very fondly and famously this statement of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah: "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest will come unto you." We sought and obtained possibly the political kingdom, but the economic kingdom has not come because we are not in control of our currencies. And one may ask, why must we be in control of our currencies? We must be in control of our currencies because it is the medium of exchange. We must be in control of our currency because it is what determines how our economy is going to interact with the rest of the world. We must be in control of our economy because it is the summation of the goods and services that are available within a country. We must control our currency because when we borrow, how we are burdened by borrowing is determined by the character of our currencies. And many African countries indeed have recognized the need to have currencies that are strong. It is in that regard that there has been a spirited move to have common currencies in the region. The East African countries have always wanted to move towards a common currency. And it must be remembered until 1977, the three East African countries of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania had a common currency, which they pretty much controlled and which pretty much ensured that their economies were stable. we of course dissolved the East African community, and now there is once again a move towards having a common currency. In the West African region, until recently, there was a move to have a currency called the ECO, but that was torpedoed from Europe, as we know, particularly from Paris, and that was dead on arrival. And we in the Central African region, we now know with the recent events in Niger, in Mali and Burkina Faso, there is an attempt to create a currency that will cover that region. And one hopes that ultimately there will be a currency that is going to envelop the entire continent of Africa, so that Africans can transact without the midwifery of a currency whose printing they do not control, of a currency whose value they cannot determine, of a currency which can be put into their markets and which can distort the markets in a manner that affects the economies of those countries or African countries by way of undermining their gross domestic product and indeed undermining their purchasing power. One of the things that I know, for example, now is that Africans in the diaspora are now trying to come up with a currency which is denominated through resources such as solar. And I know, for example, that Zimbabwe has recently introduced a currency called the ZiG, which is denominated against the gold standard. And one hopes and, of course, believes that if this is coordinated, Africa will move from the Tower of Babel in which she now finds herself, where one moves from one country, you move from Kenya, you find the Ugandan shilling, the Tanzanian shilling, the Dilasi, the Naira, the Cedi, the Bear, and the Kwanza. This kind of scenario is not good for African economies, and the sooner we migrate from this environment, from multiple currencies which are easy to manipulate, the safer Africa will be. It is important to talk about and to reiterate the fact that if indeed Africa wants to give practical meaning to Africa continental free trade area, it can only succeed if there is a common currency which is in use throughout the continent of Africa. If we are going to have an Africa continental free trade area which is underpinned by the United States dollar or is underpinned by the euro, then we are going nowhere, because economic domination will be determined by the currency that you are using on a daily basis. And a decision must be made at the level of the African Union that we must migrate from the dollar as the standard of determining the strength or otherwise of our currencies, and also migrate from the euro, so that whichever currency we create in the African continent, whether it is the Afro or whichever name we use, is going to be at the same table as other currencies, whether that currency is the dollar, whether that currency is the euro, whether that currency is the yuan, whether that currency is the rupee, whether that currency is the ruble, so that when those currencies meet in the international market, we are able to say that Africa is using a medium of trade which she controls and whose value she can determine. So from where I sit, if Africa is to realize our potential, one of the things that must be dealt with is currency. Let us migrate from these 42 currencies that we have today. Let us move towards a single currency, and let us move, if we can't do it in one fell swoop, let it start regionally, and once we have it regionally, then we will have a single currency, and let it be time bound. And in my view, in the next 10 to 15 years, we have a single currency, so that we don't denominate it with other foreign currencies. Then we can begin to talk meaningfully of a continent that is moving economically in the right direction. We can begin to talk about a continent that is talking about Agenda 2063, whose economy is not dependent upon a foreign currency, we can begin to talk about Africa continental free trade area, where somebody has a common currency which is used from Cape to Cairo, a common currency which is used from Addis Ababa to Dakar in Senegal, a common currency that is used in Kinshasa and also used in Marrakesh in Morocco. That is the kind of environment in which we should be operating, because currency is one of the keys that opens the doors of economic liberation. Africa must do that in order to gain economic liberation. Thank you very much. See you again as we continue with our conversations about the things that touch the continent of Africa.